Hey there! Before we jump into today's episode, we want to thank you for tuning into Unapologetically First Gen. This is the podcast where two sisters share what it's like to grow up as first-generation immigrants. Everything from hilarious moments to heartfelt ones. Each week, we bring you personal stories, honest conversation, and amazing guest interviews that celebrate the first-gen experience. So if you love laughing, learning, and feeling connected, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share a podcast with your friends. It really helps us grow.
Hi, I'm Stacy, the younger one. I'm a former teacher turned copywriter, cat mom, and romantasy enthusiast.
And I'm Leslie, the older one, operations expert, home baker, mom to 2 kids, and a bunny.
So, welcome to another episode. We got some feedback after releasing the first episode around the term first gen. So, we wanted to do a little bit of clarification.
Yeah, we want to talk a little bit about what it means to be, first generation American versus a first generation immigrant and why we choose to use the language that we do. So to get started, Stacy, do you want to tell us the definitions?
Okay, so by definition, a first generation American is the first person in the family to be born inside the United States, versus a first generation immigrant is the first in the family to immigrate. So it's kind of like if you're thinking about first generation college students, it's the first in your family to do something. Those are the first people going to college. So first generation American are people who are actually born here. But it's a little bit more complicated than that.
So, where were you born?
I was born here in the US.
As was I. Weird, because we keep calling ourselves immigrants. The reason I call myself an immigrant is because we grew up in a Portuguese community that was very insular. We were, in a school where we were learning in Portuguese. We were surrounded by Portuguese shops and Portuguese neighbors, and everything around us was like speaking Portuguese and doing things in Portuguese and Portuguese festivals and Portuguese church, and that was all we knew growing up.
And I think too, growing up, and we talked about this in the last episode, if you haven't listened, how other people saw us. They were not seeing us as Americans. They were seeing us as immigrants. I remember in school always being like part of like the immigrant kids, like those kids over there in the other section of the hallway. We were the immigrant kids. And so even though technically we are both first generation Americans, like I still resonate more with the immigrant community.
Agreed. Something you said just brought up this like well-buried memory. Our high school had different houses. So you would pick, in 8th grade, you would send in a thing that was like, this is the house I want to be in. And because I was in the class with all these Portuguese kids, there were all these conversations about whether or not you wanted to be in the house that had all the immigrants and how desperately so many people didn't want to be in that house because they wanted to be something other than an immigrant. Isn't that interesting? And we're talking about people who were born here, too, who have very much the same experience that you and I did.
It's interesting, too, because I remember getting advice with that transition into high school. I remember getting that advice when we were picking classes of like, well, you can take one honors class, but like really don't push yourself. And I know for a fact that kids in other classes that were not in the air quotes immigrant classroom, they were getting the advice that you should take all honors classes. If you want to go to Harvard, if you want to go to all of these Ivy League schools, you need to be taking honors classes right from freshman year. But for us, it was like, actually, you can take one, and then that's probably going to be hard for you.
I have so much rage around my high school experience with wanting to go to college, not understanding how to go to college, and the sort of adults around me not really supporting that. I feel like we could probably do an entire episode on me just ranting about how unsupportive the environment was. And like to this day, I hope this podcast gets really popular so that it can reach my high school guidance counselor, just because I'm so petty that I need her to know that I did go to college and I went and got a master's degree on top of the bachelor's degree she didn't think I could get.
This is like the same reason Black women are the most educated people in this country. It's like, I feel like I have 2 master's degrees because I had something to prove. I was like, you think I'm dumb? Okay.
If anyone in the immigrant community, or you know what, I'm going to extend this invitation out to Black women, wants to come on our podcast just so they can talk about their accolades so we can get it to their high school guidance counselors. I'm very supportive of that idea. Let's be petty together.
Okay.
We're sidetracking.
We're sidetracking, and we definitely have to do another episode about our experience in school, especially because I have a lot of thoughts about my role both as a student and then my role as a teacher and how I still saw the same problems as an educator. So keep an eye out. That is definitely being added to the list, probably as soon as I stop hitting record. But anyways, back to these definitions. I think something that's so tricky about it is, for example, we have cousins that were born there on the islands, but then they immigrated here with their parents from a very young age. But they have very similar experience as us as first generation immigrants.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think
Americans. I just use the term wrong. You see, it's very complicated.
We have a friend who was born here. He's American, and he, as a young child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, moved back to the Azores and spent his entire childhood into his late teens, early 20s there, and then moved back here, and he thinks of himself as an immigrant, but he's American, technically.
Obviously, there's a lot of implications on, like, whether you're a first-generation American or an immigrant in terms of policy, in terms of your rights in this country, especially navigating this specific political climate. But I do think that there's a lot of power in language, like putting all the politics aside when it comes to your identity, because then you really do have the language to talk about your story and your experience in a way that makes more sense to you, no matter where you were born.
Yeah, I think the language really helps validate the experience. So I think for myself if I call myself a first generation American, that's technically correct, but it doesn't feel right to the experience that I lived. So to call myself a first generation immigrant, while technically doesn't match the kind of dictionary definition, feels more true to the experience that I lived.
I do feel like your kids are first generation Americans.
I do feel that way. And I'm curious, now that you said that, what my husband would think.
Yeah.
Does he think of them as first-gen Americans or not?
But like back to like the school thing, like when I applied to college, like I was applying to scholarships that were first generation American scholarships and applying to scholarships that were first generation college student scholarships. So I think like in some ways, I don't know, it's so nuanced and messy.
I agree, it is. And I think it's I think it's more personal than it is a black and white label.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the reasons that we can talk so openly and honestly about this, I think, is something we really can't ignore given the sort of situation that this country's in, and is that we're white immigrants, which is a sort of insane thought to some people. I definitely got some feedback after the first episode that was like, a white immigrant, you never really think of a white immigrant. And it's like, that's true. In the current political climate, when you're thinking of an immigrant, you are thinking of a brown person.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And it's really important for people like you and I to talk about being immigrants, to say, hey, this is also what an immigrant experience looks like. And
it's because, right, we can turn our immigrant experience off. We can turn it off and just be white and just be American. And that's why like people are not really thinking about like white immigrants. Like you're not really thinking about like Irish people anymore as immigrants because they became white over the past 50, 60 years, right? They've navigated what's the right term?
They've sort of successfully assimilated, maybe. I would make that argument more for Italians.
Interesting, interesting. We got to get some different people on this
I
podcast.
would be really interested. Like when I think about, this sort of, I mean, I agree, like that like Irish people are also white immigrants. I completely agree with that statement. But maybe because here where we are, we have a lot of like Irish pubs with Irish music. It really feels like they're also this group very similar to how we grew up, where they're holding on to their culture. And I know like Italians have like the North End in Boston is very Italian, but it feels more um
like capitalist.
Yeah. Than it does feel like Italian culture. And I would be so interested to talk to somebody who is a first gen immigrant or first gen Italian American to hear about how they are feeling about this exact topic.
It's interesting too, and I wonder if it changes by location too. So if you go to New York, New Jersey, is the community feel different, right? Because different pockets of immigrants immigrated to different places.
Right. And maybe because when I'm thinking about specifically Italians, and I don't know why Italians popped into my head, probably because I have a love affair with their food. But I don't know why, but like specific to that is that I'm not hearing a lot of Italian.
No.
When I'm thinking about the Italian immigrants. So like speaking Portuguese, or anytime I think anybody that I run across in my day-to-day life might speak Portuguese, I first words out of my mouth, I'm like, do you speak Portuguese? And then we have this like little moment of cultural excitement. And where I live, we have a lot of Brazilians. Last week we ordered a pizza, we had it delivered, and I went to the door to get it. And my kids were running, like just running towards the door because they're not homebodies and they always want to be outside. And so I said to them in Portuguese, I said, stay back there. It's too cold near the door.
Very Portuguese thing to say.
It's a very Portuguese thing to say. And the delivery driver got so excited. He was like, "Você fala português?" And I was like, "Yes." I was like, "Você é brasileiro?" And he was like, "Oh, I'm Brazilian and Italian. I grew up in Italy, and I spent some time in Brazil, and now I'm here." And I was like, that's so cool. I was like, I want to hear more about your life. And this is literally like a 3-minute exchange on my front doorstep as I'm like holding a hot pizza.
Clearly, you should have invited him on this podcast.
I know, I should have. You know what? For the podcast, I will keep ordering pizza from that place until the same driver comes to my door. And then I'll be like, "Excuse me, sir, I have a podcast that I'd like you to be on. When do you finish delivering pizza?" So anyway, I'm willing to make sacrifices for this conversation to continue.
But yes, the idea of the white immigrant is not really something that people think of when you think about the white experience. And
it's not something that policy is written around.
It is not.
In this country.
Agreed. But I think we are able to have this podcast and to talk about some of these issues with like a relative safety because of our whiteness, because we know that we have citizenship. ICE is not going to show up at our door. ICE is not going to show up at our parents' door.
I'm not afraid to send my kids to school. I know it's a very scary time for a lot of immigrants to be sending their kids to school right now. And I don't have that fear. And I'm very lucky in that.
And I will say, like, not that there's no fear, because I've definitely talked about this in therapy. I'm like, I feel like I'm going to be on a list. I'm probably already on a list.
I think that based on, like, my social media posts, though.
Well, yeah, this is just an extension.
An extension of, they're like, you follow and make a lot of liberal comments. Speaking about language and the white immigrant, I think it's really important to talk about how we talk about white Americans who move to other countries, and we don't call them immigrants. We call them expats. And Portugal is seeing a lot of expats right now. It's become very popular for wealthy white people to go there and retire there. There's a huge expat community of rich white retirees going to Portugal, and that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, so I was actually just at the Azores, and one of the main struggles that they talked about is the cost of housing has gone up so much, which for me, it still feels low, but based on how much money they make, it is a lot. And it's because all of these, they call them the foreigners, all of these foreigners come in and they buy these houses because for the foreigners, the houses are cheap and they just want somewhere to retire that's like nice and beautiful and relaxing. But then it makes it so these people,
And inexpensive.
and inexpensive, but these people who have been on the island and have grown up there, they are now not able to buy houses.
Yeah, it's exactly what we saw in our neighborhood growing up. You know, our parents came here. They were immigrants. They worked in a factory. They were cleaning houses and offices, and they were able to buy a house in a city that I can't afford to buy a house in, and you can't afford to buy a house in,
And I will never be able to afford to buy a house in.
and you know, the only people buying houses in this city are people who are extremely wealthy.
Oh yeah, so I also pet sit in addition to having my copywriting business. And a lot of the times I go into these luxury apartment buildings to pet sit for these owners. And of course, I'm curious. So I'm Googling, like, how much is the rent in these luxury apartment buildings? And it's like one bedroom apartment starting at $3,000 a month, which is like, that's $36,000 a year. And when you look at jobs, say a paraprofessional in a classroom, when I left teaching, paraprofessionals were making just over $30,000, which means that a paraprofessional does not have enough money to rent a house in the same neighborhood that they are working in because either they need a partner and then all of their money is going to rent and they barely have enough money for anything else, or they're living probably like an hour away and commuting in, but it's like, who has those jobs? It's the immigrants.
Right. It is. When I was living in suburbia, it was all of the outdoorsy jobs, like you just saw it left and right. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, when I drive through the wealthy areas, like near where I live, we're still seeing immigrants out there doing all the landscaping, doing all of even the trash pickup in my neighborhood. I'm just realizing is definitely an immigrant, and I only know that, or two, right? Two guys. I only know that because I ran out to give them Christmas cookies, and one, I think I scared the man because I like ran down my driveway before they drove away, and I was like, "Wait!" And I'm holding like two tins. And I was like, I have a gift! And he was just like, I could tell he was like, is this white woman gonna yell at me? And then I was like, oh, I just wanted to give you these. Merry Christmas. I baked them yesterday. And I was like, oh, one for each of you. And he was like, thanks. But he did have a little bit of an accent. And we just spoke for a couple of minutes. But I'm saying is, you're still seeing folks doing all these annual jobs, and it's like, where are you living? Probably not in these wealthy neighborhoods.
And I think too, like for our listeners, like we're saying, okay, a lot of times immigrants are forced to take these lower paying jobs, but I am not necessarily talking about undocumented people. Like,
no, I think I want to use our parents as the example. They came here, they had a visa, they were permanent residents before they did their citizenship. They worked factory jobs, they were cleaning offices. It's not undocumented. So when we're when people are writing policy in their heads, they're thinking that they're hurting these quote unquote criminals. It's like you're not. You're hurting people who are working so hard, who did everything right, and who deserve respect and dignity that you're trying to take away.
Yeah, and sometimes too about like people who are highly educated in other countries and then come here and their education is not seen as valuable.
Oh, now that you say that, I just thought we call, we call rich white Americans that go to other countries expats. But when you're talking about wealthy, say brown immigrants that come here to take highly educated positions, we're still calling them immigrants. We're not calling them expats. Why aren't they expats when they come here? That word is very, very specifically used for white people.
Oh, for sure. It is definitely a white
It's
term.
like it's like I don't want to be called an immigrant, so we need a new term for this. And that's what it feels like.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Do you want to do final thoughts?
Sure. So we kind of talked about a lot of things, but we really wanted to clarify first generation immigrant versus American and why Leslie and I really resonate with calling ourselves immigrants because we are part of that immigrant community. But it really comes down to it is so messy, it is so nuanced, and every immigrant has their own story. And having language to talk about their own story is a way to validate their experience. And that really is what this podcast is all about. So, with that, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Unapologetically First Gen. If this episode resonated with you, or if you have your own first gen stories to share, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on Stacy Braga Copy and Rather Be Baking Bread on Threads and Instagram, linked in the show notes below. And don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share this podcast with someone who'd love it. Until next time, keep embracing your roots and making your own path.